Right. Hold on to your civil liberties, because what I'm about to tell you is so mental it makes dystopian fiction look like a gentle bedtime story. Picture this. It's a lovely Saturday afternoon in London, and hundreds of pensioners, we're talking about people who remember when Britain actually stood for something, decide to have a peaceful protest in Parliament Square. What happens next? The Metropolitan Police swoops in like they're raiding a terrorist cell and arrests 466 people for the heinous crime of holding placards. Yes, you heard that right. We've officially entered the Twilight Zone where your nan can get arrested under terrorism laws for disagreeing with government policy. And at the center of this constitutional catastrophe, Yvette Cooper, who's apparently decided that the best way to fight terrorism is to arrest everyone who disagrees with her definition of it. Now, before we dive into this absolute masterclass in government overreach, let me paint you a picture of exactly how balmy the situation has become. Police arrested 466 people in central London on Saturday for protesting the British government's decision to ban the pro-Palestinian activist group Palestine Action under anti-terrorism laws. 466 people. That's not a protest arrest. That's practically a census of everyone who turned up. It's like they brought a fleet of police vans and just started loading people in like they're collecting recyclables. But here's where it gets absolutely mental. Half of these dangerous terrorists were over 60 years old. We're talking about people who are more likely to be worried about their pension than planning the next 9/11. 9 to 7 of them were in their 70s. Picture this. Your granddad, who can barely figure out how to use his smartphone, getting handcuffed under the Terrorism Act because he held up a sign saying Free Palestine. It's like arresting the cast of Last of the Summer Wine for international conspiracy. Campaigners say the detentions marked the largest ever mass arrest at a single protest by the London police. Think about that for a moment. The largest mass arrest in a single operation in over a decade wasn't some international drug cartel or actual terrorist cell. It was a bunch of pensioners with banners. The Metropolitan Police literally made history by arresting more protesters in one go than they've ever done before, and their targets were people old enough to remember when protesting was considered a British right, not a terrorist act. So what exactly did these dangerous criminals do to warrant being treated like members of Al-Qaeda? They stood in Parliament Square, that traditional place where British people have been protesting for centuries, and held signs supporting Palestine Action, a group that Yvette Cooper decided to ban as a terrorist organization back in July. Palestine Action, maniacs, murder cult, and Russian imperial movement set to be banned following advice from cross-government experts. Notice how Palestine Action is lumped in with groups called maniacs, murder cult. Subtle as a brick through a window, our Yvette. But here's where Cooper's logic falls apart faster than a cheap umbrella in a British storm. When questioned about why she's arresting people for holding placards, she claimed these protesters might not understand the full nature of Palestine Action because of reporting restrictions on court hearings. Let me get this straight. Cooper banned an organization, won't tell us why because of national security, and then arrest people for not knowing information she's legally prevented them from knowing. It's like being arrested for not reading a book that's been classified as top secret. The Home Secretary insists that Palestine Action has carried out violent attacks, causing injuries and involving weapons and smoke bombs. Now, when most people hear weapons and smoke bombs, they are thinking machine guns and explosives. What Palestine Action actually did was spray red paint on military equipment and use smoke flares during protests. That's not exactly ISIS-level terrorism. That's more like particularly aggressive street art with political message. Palestine Action co-founder Huda Amori hit back with a statement that perfectly captures the absurdity. Spraying red paint on warplanes is not terrorism. Disrupting Israel's largest weapons manufacturer Elbit Systems by trespassing on their sites in Britain is not terrorism. She's got a point. If spray painting military equipment makes you a terrorist, then half the graffiti artists in London should be in Guantanamo Bay. The government's response has been about as convincing as a chocolate teapot. UN experts today urge the United Kingdom not to ban the direct action group Palestine Action as a terrorist organization under the Terrorism Act 2000. We are concerned at the unjustified labeling of a political protest movement as terrorist, the expert said. According to international standards, acts of protest that damage property but are not intended to kill or injure people should not be treated as terrorism. When the United Nations is telling you that you're overreaching on terrorism laws, you might want to take a long, hard look in the mirror. But wait, it gets better. or worse, depending on your appetite for constitutional chaos. Keir Starmer spokesman doubled down, claiming Palestine Action had committed 3 separate acts of terrorism, but couldn't provide details because the evidence was presented in a closed court setting due to ongoing national security reasons. So we're supposed to trust that spraying paint on military equipment constitutes terrorism, but we can't see the evidence because it's classified. It's like being told you're guilty of murder, but the body is top secret. The whole thing reads like something out of a satirical novel about authoritarian government overreach. UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk warned that the UK government's decision to prescribe the Palestine Action protest group under terrorism legislation raises serious concerns that counter-terrorism laws are being applied to conduct that is not terrorist in nature and risks hindering the legitimate exercise of fundamental freedoms across the UK. When the UN's Human Rights Chief is calling your actions disturbing, you've probably crossed a line somewhere. Tim Crosland, the former government lawyer who organized a weekend protest, absolutely nailed it when he said Cooper is so politically invested she's going to continue to defend the arrest of people simply protesting. Here's it on the fundamental problem here. This isn't about national security or fighting terrorism. This is about a government that's decided peaceful protest is inconvenient and is using terrorism laws to shut it down. Amnesty International's response was equally scathing. Chief Executive Sasha Deshmukh said, "The protesters in Parliament Square were not inciting violence, and it is entirely disproportionate to the point of absurdity to be treating them as terrorists." When human rights organizations are using phrases like disproportionate to the point of absurdity, you know you've well and truly mucked things up. But here's what makes this whole debacle particularly insidious. Cooper is using the classic authoritarian playbook. First, you classify something as terrorism without providing clear evidence. Then, when people protest that classification, you arrest them under terrorism laws. It's a perfect circle of constitutional abuse that would make Orwell weep. The timing is also suspiciously convenient. While genuine security threats exist around the world, Cooper chooses to focus a terrorism-fighting efforts on pensioners with placards. It's like having a house fire and deciding to arrest the neighbors for complaining about the smoke instead of putting out the flames. What's particularly galling is Cooper's attempt to distinguish between lawful Palestine protests and the supposedly terrorist activity. She mentioned that tens of thousands of people protesting lawfully just this weekend about some of the horrendous events that we've seen in the Middle East. So protesting about Gaza is fine, but protesting about the government banning a group that protests about Gaza makes you a terrorist. The logic is more twisted than a pretzel factory explosion. The real victims here aren't just the 466 people who spent Saturday in police cell for exercising their democratic rights. It's British democracy itself. When holding a placard in Parliament Square becomes grounds for terrorism charges, we've crossed a line that shouldn't exist in any free society. This isn't about Palestine Action. It's about whether Britain remains a country where peaceful protest is a right or a privilege that can be revoked at the government's whim. Cooper's handling of this situation reveals something deeply troubling about Labour's approach to civil liberties. They came into power criticizing the previous government's authoritarian tendencies, only to immediately start arresting pensioners under terrorism laws. It's like campaigning against police overreach and then immediately hiring more riot police. The Metropolitan Police, to their credit or discredit, depending on your perspective, executed this operation with military precision. The detentions marked the largest ever mass arrest at a single protest by the London police. They managed to arrest more peaceful protesters in one afternoon than they typically arrest actual criminals in a month. It's impressive efficiency applied to completely the wrong target. What makes this even more absurd is the government's insistence that this is about national security while simultaneously admitting they can't explain why. It's like being told you're a security threat, but the reasons are classified. Either the government has compelling evidence that Palestine Action poses a genuine terrorist threat, in which case, show us, or they don't, in which case they just criminalize political dissent. The international reaction has been swift and damning. When the UN Human Rights Office and multiple international observers are questioning your use of terrorism laws against peaceful protesters, you've probably lost a moral high ground somewhere between Downing Street and Parliament Square. Cooper's attempt to justify these arrests by claiming protesters don't know the full nature of Palestine Action is particularly cynical. If the organization is so dangerous that supporting them constitutes terrorism, surely the government should be transparent about why. Instead, We get classified evidence and secret court hearings, the hallmarks of authoritarian justice systems, not democratic ones. The broader implications are terrifying. If holding a placard supporting a banned organization makes you a terrorist, what's next? Will criticizing government policy become sedition? Will attending political meetings become conspiracy? We're sliding down a slippery slope that leads to places democratic societies shouldn't go. Thanks for watching UK Pancakes. Subscribe because apparently British democracy needs all the witnesses it can get right now.